Welcome to Wild Cowboy Tales. In the West, a man's worth is measured by the weight of his gun or the gold in his pocket. A woman's worth, that's often measured by others. But every now and then, in the dust and the indifference, a soul that the world has deemed worthless proves to be the most valuable thing of all. This is the story of such a soul, and the silent man who recognized its price. The town of Purgatory Point was a place where hope came to die. It wasn't a town so much as a collection of heat-warped buildings clinging to the edge of a vast and forgiving desert, a final, desperate gasp of civilization before the emptiness took over. The sun here was not a source of life, it was a hammer, beating down on the dust-choked streets, bleaching the life and color from everything it touched. In the center of this bleak landscape was the ocean block. It was not a grand affair, just a crude wooden platform erected in the main square. Here, twice a month, the territory's refuse was sold and claimed freight, the property of dead men, and sometimes the men and women themselves as captives, debtors, or those unfortunate enough to be labeled and claimed persons. On this particular Tuesday, the merchandise was a young woman named Mara Quinn. She stood on the block, a solitary, defiant figure in a sea of indifferent faces. Her dress was a tattered, dirt-colored rag, her feet were bare, and her wrists were bound with a rough piece of hemp rope. But she was not broken. She held her head high, her back straight. Her hair, the color of sun-scorched wheat, was a tangled mess. But her eyes were a different story. They were the color of a summer storm cloud, a deep, turbulent gray, and in their depths a small, unquenchable spark of life still flickered. She had been with a wagon train of settlers, heading for Oregon. A fever had taken her parents, and a raid by a band of Paiutes had scattered the rest. She had been found wandering, half-starved, by a patrol from Purgatory Point. With no family to claim her, no money to her name, she had been declared property of the territory, to be sold to cover the cost of her own capture and keep. The auctioneer, a man with a sweaty face and the greedy eyes of a vulture, stepped forward. "All right, folks, settle down," he called out, his voice slick and oily. "Next lot up is this one," and claimed. Healthy teeth, looks to be strong enough for field work or domestic duties. A low, crude chuckle rippled through the small crowd of men gathered around the block, hard-faced miners, trail-worn cowboys, and the town's assorted dregs. They looked at her not as a person, but as a potential beast of burden, or a momentary distraction from their own bleak lives. Mara's gaze swept over them, cold and dismissive. She refused to give them the satisfaction of her fear. She had survived the loss of her family. She had survived the wilderness. She had survived starvation. She would survive this. The spark in her eyes burned a little brighter. "What am I bid for this fine piece of unclaimed property?" the auctioneer began. "Let's start the bidding at a generous $5. $5 for a strong back and a willing pair of hands." He waited. The only sound was the incessant, whispering wind that blew dust in lazy circles around the square. The men looked her over, their gazes lingering, but no one raised a hand. $5, gentlemen," the auctioneer cajoled. "She's barely used. A $5 gold piece could buy a man a week's worth of whiskey and a decent meal. This girl, this piece of human flotsam, was not worth the price of a good drunk." The auctioneer's greasy smile began to falter. He was a man who took pride in his ability to sell anything. "All right, a bargain then. $2. To silver dollars to take her off our hands." The silence that followed was more damning than any insult. It was the silence of absolute worthlessness. Mara felt a hot flush of shame creep up her neck, a shame that was quickly consumed by a cold, hard anger. $1, the auctioneer pleaded, his voice now laced with frustration. $1, and you can lead her away right now." A man in the front spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Ain't worth $1, Silas. She's got fightin' eyes. More trouble than she's worth." The auctioneer's face turned a blotchy red. He had been beaten. "Fine," he snarled. He turned to the town's portly, lazy sheriff, who was leaning against a post, trying to look official. "She's a vagrant then. Insaleable. Take her to the jail. We'll figure out what to do with her later." The implication was clear. What to do with her was a euphemism for a grim and spoken process. Insaleable goods, human or otherwise, were disposed of. The sheriff pushed himself off the post and started to walk towards the platform, a bored, tired look on his face. This was it. The moment Mara's small, defiant spark was about to be extinguished. She tensed, her bound hands clenching into fists. She would not go quietly. $1. The voice was low and gravelly, like stones grinding together at the bottom of a river. It came from the back of the crowd, from the shadows of the general store's porch. It was not loud, but it cut through the silence like a razor. Every head turned. The crowd parted, and a man stepped out of the shadows. He was tall, and built with the lean, hard resilience of the mountains he clearly came from. He wore a simple, trail-worn buckskin shirt and dark trousers. A heavy duster hung from his broad shoulders, and his face was all but hidden under the wide brim of a sweat-stained hat. He moved with a quiet, deliberate grace, an economy of motion that spoke of a deep, coiled strength. The auctioneer squinted. "Who's that? Who bid?" The man stepped forward into the harsh sunlight. He pushed back his hat, and for the first time, Mara saw his face. It was a face that looked like it had been carved from the unforgiving landscape itself. All hard angles and sun-weathered lines. But it was his eyes that held her. They were the color of chipped slate, cold and sharp, and they were fixed on her with an unnerving, unreadable intensity. He looked at her not as an object, but as if he were seeing something deep inside her, something the rest of the world had missed. He reached into his pocket and tossed a single, heavy silver dollar onto the platform. It landed with a definitive, ringing clink. The auctioneer, stunned but eager to be rid of his troublesome merchandise, quickly found his voice. "Sold," he cried out, "for $1, to the stranger." The man walked to the platform. He did not look at the auctioneer or the sheriff. His slate gray eyes never left Mara's. He stepped onto the block, pulled a well-worn bowie knife from a sheath on his belt, and in one clean, efficient motion, he cut her bonds. He stepped back, sheathing his knife. The two of them stood there on the block, the silent, mysterious mountain man and the girl the world had deemed worthless. Mara rubbed her raw, chafed wrists. She looked at the man, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and a new, terrifying hope. He had saved her. But for what? "What now?" she asked, her voice a hoarse whisper. The man looked at her for a long moment, his expression unchanging. "Now," he said, his voice a low rumble. "We walk." The walk from the auction block was a gauntlet of stares and whispers. As Mara stepped down into the dust, every eye in the square was on her. She was no longer just a piece of property, she was a mystery. She could feel the weight of their speculation, their crude curiosity. She pulled the rags of her dress tight around herself and walked with her head held high, her gaze fixed on the broad, duster-clad back of the man in front of her. Elias Ward, though she did not yet know his name, moved through the town like a rock parting a stream. Men who had been sneering a moment before now looked at the ground, instinctively making way. His silence was more intimidating than any threat. He led her past the saloon, past the blacksmith's, towards the livery stable at the edge of the town. They had almost made it when three men stepped out from an alley, blocking their path. Mara recognized them from the auction. They were miners, their faces grimy, their eyes filled with a mean, predatory light. "Hold on there, friend," the leader, a big man with a greasy beard, said, his voice a low sneer. "That's a mighty fine purchase you made. We was just wonderin' what the resale price might be." He looked Mara up and down, a foul grin on his face. "We'll give you $5 for her. A handsome profit for you." They saw her not as a person who had been saved, but as a commodity that had merely changed owners. Mara tensed, her hand instinctively going to the spot where a weapon should have been. Elias did not turn to face them fully. He just stopped, his back still mostly to them. "She's not for sale," he said, his voice flat and cold as a tombstone. "Now, see here," the miner said, taking a step forward, his hand drifting towards the pistol on his hip. "We ain't a skin." Elias moved. It was not a fast move. It was a slow, deliberate turn. He faced the three men, and for the first time, they saw the full, chilling emptiness in his slate gray eyes. It was the look of a man who had seen the bottom of the world and was not impressed by three drunken bullies. "I am," he said. His voice was still quiet, but it carried a weight that made the air grow thick and heavy. He didn't raise his hands. He didn't reach for his own gun. He simply stood there, a mountain of quiet, absolute menace. The three miners hesitated. They were used to bluster and threats, to the loud, violent dance of the saloon brawl. They did not know what to do with this silence, with this man who seemed utterly devoid of fear or anger. They looked into his eyes and saw a promise of a kind of violence that was far beyond their comprehension. The leader swallowed, his bravado deserting him. "Just making a friendly offer," he muttered. He and his friends shuffled backward and disappeared back into the alley. Elias watched them go, his expression unchanging. Then he turned and continued walking towards the livery stable, as if nothing had happened. Mara followed, her heart pounding. He had not laid a hand on them, had not even raised his voice, but he had defeated them with the sheer, crushing weight of his presence. Who was this man? At the livery, he paid for a single horse, a sturdy-looking buckskin. He also bought a saddle, a bridle, and a blanket. He said nothing to her as he saddled the animal. He simply worked with a quiet, efficient competence. When he was done, he turned to her. "Can you ride?" Mara nodded. She had grown up on a farm. He simply gestured to the horse. She mounted, her tattered dress hiking up to her knees. He then swung up behind her, his presence a solid, intimidating weight at her back. He took the reins and, without a backward glance at the town of Purgatory Point, he urged the horse into a steady trot, heading out into the vast, empty plains. They rode for hours in a silence that was as vast and empty as the landscape around them. The sun beat down, and the world was a shimmering, heat-hazed canvas of brown and pale blue. Mara was a storm of questions and fear. Where was he taking her? What did he want from her? The man who had saved her was as much a mystery, and as much a threat, as the wilderness they were riding into. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in soft shades of purple and orange, he finally pulled the horse to a halt in a small, sheltered arroyo. He dismounted and then, with a surprising gentleness, helped her down. Her legs were stiff and shaky. He set about making a small, smokeless fire with unpracticed ease. He took a side of bacon and a bag of coffee from his saddlebags. He did not coddle her, but he was not unkind. He handed her a canteen of water. As the bacon sizzled in the pan, filling the small arroyo with a mouth-watering aroma, Mara knew she could not be silent any longer. She had to know. "Why?" she asked, her voice a hoarse whisper. "Why did you do it?" Elias looked up from the fire. The flickering light cast deep shadows on his weathered face, making his eyes seem like dark, bottomless pits. He looked at her for a long moment, his gaze as unreadable as ever. "Because no one else did," he said simply. It was not an answer. It was a deflection. "What do you want from me?" she pressed, her voice gaining a little strength. He considered the question. "Right now," he said, his voice a low rumble, "I want you to eat. You're no good to anyone half-starved." He served her a generous portion of bacon on a tin plate. She was so hungry she devoured it without a second thought. It was the first decent meal she had had in months. After they had eaten, he took the first watch. He sat with his back against a rock, his rifle across his lap, staring out into the darkness. He was a silent, vigilant guardian. Mara lay wrapped in the blanket he had given her, pretending to sleep. She watched him, this man who was both her savior and her captor. He had paid a silver dollar for her life, and she had no idea if she had been bought out of slavery, or if she had just been sold to a new, and infinitely more dangerous, master. The weight of that silver dollar felt as heavy as a gravestone. The journey into the high country was a silent education. For 3 days, Elias Ward led them away from the flat, sun-baked plains and into the rugged, pine-choked foothills of the mountains. He moved with a purpose that was both relentless and deeply attuned to the land around him. He was not just traveling through the wilderness, he was a part of it. Mara, riding in front of him on the single horse, learned about him not through his words, which were as sparse as the settlements in this country, but through his actions. She learned he could read the land like a book, finding hidden springs where the ground looked barren, pointing out the subtle signs of a game trail that was invisible to her eyes. He taught her, without teaching, the language of the mountain. He would stop and point to a particular plant. "Mullein," he would say, his voice a low rumble. "Boil the leaves for a cough. The flowers in oil for an earache." Another time, he would gesture to the tracks on the ground. "Bear. A big one. Passed this way this morning." See how the dew is still disturbed in the shadow of the print? He was giving her the tools of survival. It was a strange and personal kind of care. He was not being kind, not in the way a softer man would be. He was being practical. He was making her stronger, more self-sufficient. It was as if he were preparing her for a test, or perhaps for a time when he would not be there to protect her. The landscape itself was a balm to her soul. After the oppressive, dusty confines of Purgatory Point, the cool, pine-scented air of the mountains felt like a lungful of freedom. The vast, silent spaces, which might have terrified another woman, were a comfort to Mara. She had been born in a place like this, a place of tall trees and quiet strength. She was rediscovering a part of herself she had thought long dead. The fragile truce between them was tested on the third day. They were making their way up a steep, rocky trail when the sky, which had been a brilliant, cloudless blue, turned a bruised, angry purple. A sudden, violent mountain thunderstorm descended upon them. The wind howled through the canyons, and rain came down in cold, driving sheets. The trail turned to a treacherous, slick river of mud. Their horse, the sturdy buckskin, lost its footing and went down with a terrified scream, its leg twisting at an unnatural angle. They were thrown clear, landing in the mud and rocks. Elias was up in an instant, his first thought for Mara. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice sharp with a concern she had not heard before. She was bruised and shaken, but not seriously injured. The horse, however, was. Its leg was broken, a clean, sharp snap of bone. It lay in the mud, its eyes wide with pain and terror. Mara looked at the animal, and her heart ached. Elias walked to the horse's head, his face a grim and readable mask. He pulled the pistol from his holster. "No," Mara said, scrambling to her feet. "Isn't there anything we can do?" "No," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "A broken leg, in this country, it's a death sentence. To leave it like this would be cruel." He raised the pistol. Mara turned away, unable to watch. The single, sharp crack of the gunshot echoed off the canyon walls, a sound of grim, necessary mercy. They were afoot, stranded, with a storm raging around them. "This way," Elias said, his voice cutting through the roar of the wind. He took her arm, his grip firm, and led her off the trail, up a steep, rocky incline. He seemed to know exactly where he was going. He led her to a place she would never have found on her own, a shallow cave, a hollowed-out space under a massive granite overhang, protected from the wind and the rain. Inside the cave, the world was suddenly quiet. The storm was a muffled roar outside. Elias, with a practiced efficiency, had a small fire going in minutes, its warmth a welcome blessing against the bone-deep chill. They sat in silence for a long time, watching the flames, the shared hardship of the past few hours creating a new, deeper level of connection between them. He had been her captor, her savior, her teacher. Now, in this small, firelit cave, he was simply her partner in survival. "You've been here before," she said, breaking the silence. It wasn't a question. He nodded, staring into the flames. "A long time ago." "This is your home," she stated, a new understanding dawning. "These mountains." "They were," he said, his voice a low, gravelly sound thick with unspoken memory. "They were home, once." He was a man of ghosts, she realized. His past was a heavy blanket he wore, even in the heat of summer. She, who had her own fresh ghosts, recognized the shape of his. "Thank you," she said softly, for everything." He looked at her, and for the first time, the cold, slate gray of his eyes seemed to warm, just for a moment. "You're a survivor, Mara Quinn," he said. It was the first time he had used her full name. "You don't need my help to survive." "Maybe not," she replied, her own gaze steady. "But it's nice not to have to do it alone." A new understanding passed between them in that moment. The storm outside raged, but inside their small, temporary sanctuary, a fragile peace had taken root. He had bought her for $1, had saved her from the cruelties of men. But here, in the heart of the wild and tamed mountains, they were equals to solitary, wounded souls who had, by a strange and violent twist of fate, found in each other a refuge from the storm. The storm passed as quickly as it had arrived, leaving the world washed clean and smelling of wet pine and damp earth. They emerged from the cave into a world of brilliant, dazzling sunlight. The journey resumed, but it was different now. They were on foot, and the shared vulnerability of their situation had created a new, easier intimacy between them. Elias was no longer just a guide. He was a companion. He still spoke little, but his silences were no longer intimidating. They were comfortable, filled with the unspoken language of the people who had come to understand each other on a level that was deeper than words. Late in the afternoon of the next day, they arrived. His home was not what Mara had expected. It was not a grand ranch house or a fortified cabin. It was a small, simple structure, built of hand-hewn logs, nestled so perfectly into the side of a mountain that it seemed to have grown there. It overlooked a small, and possibly green meadow, through which a clear, fast-running creek flowed. It was a place of profound, almost sacred peace. A thin wisp of smoke was rising from the stone chimney. As they drew closer, the cabin door opened, and an old man stepped out. He was ancient, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, his long, white hair braided in the old way of the Ute people. "You are late, Elias," the old man said, his voice a dry, rustling sound like autumn leaves. "The coffee is almost cold." Elias smiled, a genuine, warm smile that transformed his hard face, making him look years younger. "I ran into some trouble on the trail, old friend," he said. He gestured to Mara. "This is Mara Quinn. Mara, this is Here's the Wind." The old Ute looked at Mara, his dark, intelligent eyes seeming to see right through her. He nodded slowly. "The trouble has a name, I see." He looked at her tattered dress and the exhaustion in her face. "Welcome, child. Our home is yours." The hour was a surprise. Elias was not a hermit. He was part of a small, two-person community. The inside of the cabin was as simple and honest as the outside. It was one room, dominated by a large stone fireplace. There were two rough-hewn beds, a table, and shelves filled with books, dried herbs, and neatly stacked provisions. It was a place of quiet, scholarly solitude. Here's the Wind, it turned out, was the last of his people from this particular part of the mountains. He had found a wounded Elias years ago and had nursed him back to health. A bond of deep, abiding friendship had formed between the two solitary men, and they had shared this small pocket of paradise ever since. Mara's arrival was accepted with a quiet and questioning grace. She was given one of the beds, fed a hearty stew, and then, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she was left alone. Not abandoned, but given the space to simply be. The days that followed were a time of healing. The mountains worked their magic on her. The quiet, the clean air, the steady, peaceful rhythm of life in the cabin, all served to soothe the raw, jagged edges of her soul. She spent her days exploring the small meadow, helping Here's the Wind tend his garden, and learning the simple, profound peace of a life lived in harmony with the land. But her curiosity about Elias grew. He was a different man here. The hard, cold shell he wore in the outside world was gone, replaced by a quiet, contemplative man who would spend hours reading by the fire, or sitting with Here's the Wind. The two of them in a comfortable silence that was a conversation in itself. But there were still ghosts. Sometimes, at night, she would hear him cry out in his sleep, a single, anguished word, a name, Sarah. She knew it was not her place to ask, but she could not help but wonder about the woman who had left such a deep and healed scar on this quiet, solitary man. She found her answer one afternoon, while Elias and Here's the Wind were away hunting. She was cleaning the small cabin, an act of gratitude, when she found a small, locked wooden chest under Elias's bed. It was the only object in the cabin that seemed to be guarded. Her curiosity got the better of her. She found that one of her hairpins, with a little work, could pick the simple lock. She opened the chest. Inside, there was not gold or guns. There was a life that had been packed away and hidden. There was a stack of letters, tied with a faded blue ribbon, written in a delicate, feminine hand. There was a small, pressed wildflower, its petals as fragile as a butterfly's wing. And there was a single, dog-eared wanted poster. She unrolled it. The drawing was of a beautiful, smiling young woman with dark, intelligent eyes. The name was Sarah Ward. The crime listed was absconding from indentured servitude. The reward was $100. And at the bottom, the poster was signed by a familiar name, Silas Kane, Justice of the Peace, St. Louis. The same name from the wanted poster Jacob Harper had been on. Mara stared at the poster, her blood turning to ice. The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place, forming a picture of a tragedy so profound it made her own seem small in comparison. Elias had not just been a bounty hunter. He had hunted for one person, his own wife. A woman who had been a slave, who had run away, and who had been hunted by a powerful, ruthless man. She heard the sound of their return. She quickly put everything back in the chest, locked it, and slid it back under the bed, her heart pounding. That evening, as they sat by the fire, she looked at Elias with new eyes. She saw not just a quiet, mysterious man. She saw a man who had loved and lost on a scale she could barely comprehend. She understood the source of his ghosts now, and she understood why he had bid a single silver dollar for a worthless and claimed girl on an auction block in Purgatory Point. He hadn't just been saving her. He had been trying, in a small, desperate way, to save the ghost of the woman he had lost. He had been trying to rewrite the ending of his own tragic story. The discovery in the wooden chest changed everything. Mara now looked at Elias not as a savior or a captor, but as a fellow survivor, a man whose own past was a mirror of her deepest fears. The knowledge was a heavy and spoken thing between them. She did not confront him. She understood that some wounds were too deep to be exposed to the light, but the knowledge created a new, more profound bond between them. And in spoken empathy, she began to see the small signs of his grief, way his eyes would sometimes get a distant, haunted look, the way he would hold a particular, worn-out book without reading it. Their quiet, peaceful existence was a fragile bubble, and they both knew it. The world outside the mountains had not forgotten them. The men from Purgatory Point, the ones who had seen her as a piece of property, would not simply let her disappear. The intrusion, when it came, was not a thundering posse, but a single, lone rider. It was Jeb, the old hired hand from Eloise's ranch, who had ridden for 2 weeks, following a cold trail and a desperate hunch. He had been a friend of Thomas's, and the story the town was telling didn't sit right with him. He found their valley by sheer, dumb luck, and he brought with him news that shattered their peace. "It's about the man in your barn," he said to Eloise, after she had recovered from the shock of seeing a familiar face. The man who looked like Thomas. The story Jeb told was a confusing, tangled one. After Eloise and Jacob had left for Santa Fe, the real story of the stagecoach ambush had come out. A wounded outlaw, one of the few survivors, had been captured. He had told the authorities everything. He had told them about the Pinkerton agent, Thomas Harper, and his identical twin brother, Jacob, the gunfighter. He had told them about the ledger, and about the man who had ordered the hit, Silas Kane. The news had sent shockwaves through the territory. But the most shocking part was what the outlaw had said last. He said that Silas Kane was not just a criminal mastermind. He was obsessed. He had been hunting not just the ledger, but a woman. A woman who had been his indentured servant, who had escaped from him years ago. A woman named Sarah. The name hit Elias like a physical blow. He had been standing apart from the conversation, but at the mention of her name, he went rigid. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice a low, dangerous growl. Jeb, intimidated by this fierce, silent man, stammered out the rest of the story. Kane had believed that Sarah had fled west, and that the Harper brothers were helping her. The ambush, the hunt for the ledger, it was all tied up in his obsessive, years-long search for the woman he considered his property. The two separate, tragic stories of their pasts had just collided with the force of a head-on train wreck. Sarah, Silas Kane, it was all connected. "Where is this Kane now?" Elias demanded, his eyes like chips of ice. "That's the thing," Jeb said, his own voice filled with a grim urgency. "He's not in jail. He's powerful. He has friends in high places. He escaped before they could arrest him. And he's coming here. He tortured the outlaw for information. He knows about the Harper ranch. He knows about the widow. And he knows that Jacob Harper was last seen with her. He's coming to finish the job, to wipe out the last of the people who can testify against him." The bubble of their peaceful existence had just burst. The war they had both thought was over was not. It had just followed them into the heart of their sanctuary. That night, the small cabin was a place of tense, grim planning. Here's the wind. The old Ute sat by the fire, his face a mask of ancient wisdom. He had seen many wars. This was just one more. "You cannot fight an army, Elias," he said, his voice a dry rustle. "You must be a ghost." A whisper on the wind. "I'm done whispering," Elias said, his voice a low, hard growl. He was cleaning his rifle, his movements sharp and precise. The quiet, contemplative man was gone, replaced by the hunter. Eloise, who had been listening to all of this with a growing sense of dread, finally spoke. "This man, Cain," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "He is my ghost, as much as he is yours. He killed my husband because of this obsession. He is coming to my home to finish what he started." She stood up, and her eyes, which had finally lost their haunted look, now burned with a cold, clear fire. "I will not run. I will not hide. I will stand with you." It was a declaration that sealed their fates. They were no longer two separate people with two separate pasts. They were allies, bound by a shared enemy, a shared grief, and a shared, desperate need for a final reckoning. Jeb, the old hired hand, a man who had only come looking for answers, looked at the three of them, grim-faced gunfighter, the determined widow, and the ancient Ute warrior, and made his own decision. "Thomas was a good man," he said simply. "I'll stand with you." Their small and likely army was formed. For people against a coming storm. They would not wait for Cain to come to them. They would go to meet him. They would use their knowledge of the mountains, of the wilderness, to wage a war on their own terms. The paths of Eloise Harper and Elias Ward had finally, terribly, collided. And from the wreckage, a new, and infinitely more dangerous, alliance had been born. They were no longer just survivors. They were avengers. The decision to fight, to actively seek out Silas Cain rather than wait for his inevitable rival, transformed the small, peaceful cabin into a war room. The four of the Melias, Eloise, Jeb, and Here's the Wind were a strange and unlikely council of war, a fusion of different worlds and different skills, united by a single, grim purpose. Here's the Wind, with his profound, almost mystical knowledge of the mountains, spread out a large, tan deerskin on the floor. It was a map, not of towns and roads, but of the land itself, off secret passes, hidden springs, and ancient trails known only to his people. This would be their battlefield. "Cain is a man of the city," the old Ute said, his gnarled finger tracing a line through a series of jagged peaks. "He thinks in straight lines, in armies and direct assaults. The mountain does not think in straight lines. It is a maze. We will use its nature against him." Elias, the tactician, the hunter of men, took charge of the strategy. "He'll have trackers," he said, his voice a low, focused growl. "He'll be coming in force. We can't meet him head-on. We bleed him. We harry him. We turn the mountains, his enemy, into our weapon." Their plan was one of classic guerrilla warfare. They would not be an army. They would be ghosts, just as Here's the Wind had said. They would strike and fade, using their superior knowledge of the terrain to appear and disappear at will. Jeb, the old ranch hand, brought a practical, grounded knowledge to the table. "He'll have a supply wagon," he said, his voice a slow, deliberate drawl. "An army that big needs food, water, and ammunition. The wagon will be slow. It will be his anchor, and it will be his weakness." Eloise, who had been listening intently, found her own role. She was not a warrior or a tactician. She was the keeper of the story, the one who understood the why of their fight. And she had an idea, a piece of psychological warfare that was as potent as any bullet. "Cain is hunting for the ledger," she said, her voice firm. "He believes it's the only thing that can destroy him. What if we let him think he can get it?" Her plan was audacious. They would create a decoy, a false ledger. They would use her knowledge of her husband's handwriting, which she had studied for years, to create a convincing replica. They would plant this false ledger, let Cain's men find it, and use it to lure him into a trap of their own choosing. It was a brilliant, dangerous piece of deception, a plan that would require all their combined skills. For the next 3 days, their small cabin became a hive of activity. Elias and Jeb rode out, not to fight, but to prepare the battlefield. They chose their ground, a narrow, winding canyon known to the Utes as the Canyon of Whispering Winds, a natural death trap with high and scalable walls and only one entrance and exit. They began to rig a series of rock slides and deadfalls, traps that could be sprung from a distance, designed to seal the canyon and turn it into a prison. Meanwhile, in the cabin, Eloise and Here's the Wind worked on the decoy. Here's the Wind, a master of natural dyes and pigments, created a perfect replica of the aged paper and faded ink of the original ledger. Eloise, with a hand that was surprisingly steady, began the painstaking process of forging her dead husband's writing, filling the pages with a mixture of real, damning information and false clues designed to lead Cain exactly where they wanted him. The act of writing her husband's words, of reliving his final, dangerous mission, was both a painful and a cathartic process. She was not just forging a book, she was honoring his memory, finishing his work. On the third day, there scouts a pair of young Ute boys loyal to Here's the Wind returned with news. Cain's army, a force of 30 men, had been spotted. They were 2 days away, moving slowly but steadily, their supply wagon a lumbering beast in their midst. The time had come. The council of war was over. The battle was about to begin. They divided their forces. Jeb, the steady, reliable ranch hand, was given a crucial task. He would take the false ledger and play the part of a terrified informant, betraying them to Cain's men. He would lead them on a chase, straight towards the Canyon of Whispering Winds. Elias and Here's the Wind would be the ghosts in the rocks, the unseen force that would spring the trap. And Eloise. She was given the most dangerous, and most important, job of all. She was entrusted with the real ledger. She would not be at the battle. She would take a secret, ancient Ute trail and ride north, towards the telegraph office in the next territory. Her mission was to get the truth to the world, to ensure that even if they all died in that canyon, Silas Cain's empire would fall. Their goodbye was a quiet, solemn affair. They were for people from 4 different worlds, bound together by a shared, desperate cause. "Be safe, Ellie," Elias said, his voice rough with an emotion he did not name. He placed his hand on her shoulder, a brief, powerful touch. "You too, Elias," she replied, her own voice steady. She watched as he and Here's the Wind disappeared into the high country, to silent, deadly phantoms. She watched as Jeb, his face a mask of grim determination, rode off in a different direction, the false ledger tucked into his saddlebags. Then, she turned her own horse north. She was alone again, but she was not the same woman who had been found wandering in the wilderness. She was a messenger, a soldier, the keeper of a legacy. The fate of their small, desperate war rested on her shoulders, and on the speed of her horse. The spark had been ignited. The trap was set. The final, bloody act was about to begin. The Canyon of Whispering Winds was a place of ill omen. The Utes believed that the spirits of the dead lingered there, their mournful sighs carried on the constant, low wind that gave the canyon its name. For Silas Cain and his army, it was about to become their tomb. Jeb played his part perfectly. He allowed himself to be captured by one of Cain's advanced patrols. He was a picture of a terrified old man, easily broken. He told them a story of a hidden ledger, of a man and a woman who had betrayed him, and of a plan to escape through a secret canyon pass. Cain, arrogant and convinced of his own superiority, swallowed the bait whole. The thought of finally getting his hands on the ledger, the one thing that could destroy him, overrode his natural caution. He ordered his entire force to converge on the canyon. He arrived at the mouth of the pass in the late afternoon. The canyon was a narrow, ominous slash in the earth. He sent in a few scouts. They reported back that the canyon was clear, that they had found fresh tracks leading through it. The trap was perfectly set. Cain led his men into the canyon. They moved in a long, confident column, their supply wagon rumbling behind them. The high, sheer walls on either side gave them a sense of security, of being protected from any attack from the flanks. They did not realize they were walking into a cage. From a high, hidden perch overlooking the entrance, Elias and Here's the Wind watched them enter. They were the silent, patient predators, watching the wolves walk into their snare. They waited until the entire column, including the supply wagon, was inside. Then, Here's the Wind gave a soft, low whistle, the call of a canyon wren. It was the signal. Elias lit the fuse to the first set of charges. The explosion was not a massive, deafening roar. It was a deep, powerful boom that seemed to come from the very bowels of the earth. The weakened cliff face at the mouth of the canyon disintegrated, sending thousands of tons of rock and earth crashing down, completely sealing the entrance. Cain and his men were trapped. They spun their horses around, their faces masks of confusion and a dawning, terrible fear. At that moment, a second, identical explosion rocked the canyon from the other end. Elias had rigged both the entrance and the exit. The cage was now locked. Pandemonium erupted. The narrow canyon became a chaotic, screaming mass of panicked men and terrified horses. And then, the real attack began. From the high and seen ledges on both sides of the canyon, a hail of arrows began to rain down. Here's the Wind was not alone. He had brought with him a dozen Ute warriors, silent, ghostly figures who had appeared as if from the very rock itself. They were masters of this terrain, of this kind of warfare. Their arrows were not aimed to kill. They were aimed at the horses, at the water barrels, at the wheels of the supply wagon. It was a terrifying, demoralizing assault from an invisible enemy. In the midst of the chaos, a single rifle began to speak. Elias. He moved from position to position, a phantom sniper. His shots were not random. Each one was a carefully placed, executed punctuation mark in a sentence of death. He targeted the leaders, the men who were trying to rally the others. One by one, they fell. The Canyon of Whispering Winds became a slaughterhouse. Cain's army, so formidable on the open plains, was helpless, caught in a death trap, being picked apart by an enemy they could not see. Cain himself, a man whose entire life had been about control, was losing his mind. He roared and screamed, firing his pistol blindly at the rocks, mad king in his crumbling kingdom. The battle raged for an hour. When it was over, the silence that fell was profound, broken only by the groans of the wounded and the sad, whispering wind. Of Cain's 30 men, more than half were dead or wounded. The rest were broken, terrified, their will to fight completely shattered. Elias and Here's the Wind did not offer them a chance to surrender. They simply disappeared, melting back into the mountains from which they had come. They left the survivors trapped in the canyon with their dead, with no horses, no water, and no escape. They had not just defeated an army, they had utterly destroyed it. They had left one man alive and unwounded, by design. Jeb. He had survived the ambush. His job was to deliver the final message. He stumbled into the nearest town 2 days later, a haunted, broken man, telling a terrifying story of a canyon of ghosts, of an army of Ute warriors, and of a single, demonic rifleman who could not be seen, and who could not miss. The legend of the Canyon of Whispering Winds would be told for 100 years. The story of Silas Cain's phantom army, destroyed by the spirits of the mountains themselves. But the real war was not yet over. Elias and Here's the Wind knew that Cain himself had survived the initial slaughter. And a man like Cain, a cornered, wounded animal, was at his most dangerous. They knew he would find a way out of that canyon. And they knew that his first, and only, thought would be of revenge. A revenge directed at the one person he now knew held the key to his entire downfall, the woman riding north with his secrets. While the battle raged in the Canyon of Whispering Winds, Eloise was fighting her own, quieter war. It was a war against distance, against time, and against the ever-present ghost of fear. She rode north, the real ledger a hard, vital weight in her saddlebag. She was no longer just a woman fleeing a threat. She was a messenger, carrying a truth that had the power to reshape the territory. She followed the secret Ute trail that Here's the Wind had shown her on the deerskin map. It was a treacherous, barely there path that wound its way through the highest, most remote parts of the mountains. It was a path that would have been impossible for Cain's army to follow, a path that was a testament to the ancient, intimate knowledge the Utes had of their land. For 3 days, she rode. She was alone, but she did not feel lonely. The mountains, which had once been a source of awe and a little fear, now felt like an accomplice, a silent, powerful guardian. She felt the presence of Elias and the others with her, their shared purpose a constant, steadying force. She thought of Thomas, of the secret, heroic life he had led. She realized, finishing his last mission. The thought filled her not with sadness, but with a fierce, burning pride. She was no longer just his widow, the passive keeper of his memory. She was his partner, his soldier, the final instrument of his justice. On the 4th day, she emerged from the high country and onto the open plains of the next territory. She saw the thin, iron line of the railroad in the distance, and beside it, the small, bustling town of Trinidad, and its telegraph office. She had made it. She rode into the town, a strange, wild figure. A woman alone, dressed in dusty, trail-worn clothes, her face set in a mask of grim determination. She drew stares, but no one bothered her. There was an aura about her now, a quiet, dangerous confidence that warned the world to keep its distance. She went directly to the telegraph office. The operator, a young man with a green eye shade, looked up at her, surprised. "I need to send a message," she said, her voice a low, steady command. "To the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, their main office in Denver." The operator's eyes widened. He had sent messages for sheriffs and cattle barons, but never for the legendary Pinkertons. Eloise dictated the message, her words precise and clear. She detailed the existence of the ledger, the scope of Kane's criminal syndicate, and the names of the corrupt officials he had in his pocket. She told them of the ambush, of the murder of their agent, Thomas Harper, and she told them where the proof could be found. She signed it not with her own name, but with her husband's. Agent T. Harper. Final report. As the operator's key began to click, sending her message out across the wires, a profound sense of relief washed over her. It was done. The truth was out. It could no longer be buried in a shallow grave or hidden in a secret safe. It was now a part of the permanent, indelible record of the world. Her mission was complete. She could have ridden away then, disappeared, started a new life somewhere far away. But she knew she could not. Her war was not over. Jacob and the others were still back there, in the bloody aftermath of the canyon. And she knew, with a certainty that was a cold knot in her stomach, that a wounded Silas Kane was still a threat. She did not wait for a reply from the Pinkertons. She bought fresh supplies, a new, faster horse, and a box of ammunition. And then she turned and began the long, dangerous ride back south. She was no longer the messenger. She was the cavalry. She was going back to the fight, back to the man who wore her husband's face, the man who had, against all odds, become her partner. The spark she had carried into the darkness had been delivered. Now, she was riding back to help him face the final, inevitable storm. Silas Kane was a survivor. It was the quality that had allowed him to build his empire. While his army had been shattered in the Canyon of Whispering Winds, he and a handful of his most loyal men had managed to escape the death trap, climbing the treacherous rock faces, driven by a pure, animalistic will to live. He emerged from the canyon not as a king, but as a wounded wolf. His army was gone. His reputation was in tatters. All he had left was a burning, all-consuming need for revenge. He knew who was responsible. The woman. The ghost of Thomas Harper. She had the ledger. And she had his brother, the gunfighter. He did not know about the telegraph, about the message that was already mobilizing a force of hard-faced Pinkerton agents in Denver. All he knew was that he had one last, desperate hand to play. He knew where they would be. They would be at the ranch, the place where it had all started. He and his 5 remaining men, a small, desperate band of killers, made their way back towards the Harper Valley. It was a slow, grueling journey on foot, but their hatred was a fuel that kept them going. Back at the valley, and an easy peace had settled. Elias and Here's the Wind had returned from the canyon, their faces grim but triumphant. They had reunited with Jeb. They had won a great victory. But there was no celebration. They were all waiting. Waiting for Eloise to return. And waiting for Kane's inevitable last stand. They used the time to prepare. They turned the small ranch house, the place Jacob had once called a coffin, into their final fortress. They barricaded the windows, fortified the doors, and created a series of interlocking fields of fire from the house, the barn, and the surrounding trenches. Eloise arrived 2 days later, her horse lathered, her face etched with exhaustion, but her eyes bright with the news of her success. "It's done," she told them. "The message is out. The Pinkertons are coming." The news was a double-edged sword. Help was on the way. But it also meant that their time was limited. They had to hold out until the cavalry arrived. Kane and his men arrived the next afternoon. They did not try a stealthy approach. They came out of the hills like a pack of wolves, their faces contorted in masks of hate. They launched a direct, furious assault on the ranch house. The final battle for the Harper Ranch had begun. It was a siege in miniature, a desperate, brutal affair. 6 hardened killers against 2 skilled gunmen, a tough old ranch hand, and a woman who had discovered a core of pure, unadulterated steel within herself. The fighting was fierce and unrelenting. Kane's men were desperate, and they fought with the ferocity of cornered animals. But they were attacking a prepared, fortified position. Jacob and Elias were a deadly team, their rifles speaking in a steady, coordinated rhythm from the windows of the house. Job provided covering fire from the barn, and Eloise was the heart of their defense, reloading their weapons, bringing them water, and her own shotgun roaring its defiance whenever one of the attackers got too close. The battle raged for hours. The sun began to set, casting long, bloody shadows across the valley. Cain's force was whittled down, one man at a time, but they were taking their toll. Jeb was wounded, a bullet grazing his shoulder. Their ammunition was running dangerously low. As twilight fell, Cain, in a final, mad gamble, decided to end it. He ordered his two remaining men to lay down a covering fire, and he himself made a desperate, suicidal charge for the house, a burning torch in his hand. If he couldn't have the ranch, he would burn it to the ground, just as he had burned the stagecoach. Elias saw him coming. "He's mine," he growled, a lifetime of grief and rage in his voice. He stood up from the window, exposing himself to the enemy fire, and took careful aim. At that moment, a bullet from one of the other attackers struck the window frame next to him, sending a shower of splinters into his face. He flinched, his own shot going wide. Cain was almost to the house. He was about to hurl the torch onto the dry timber of the porch. Eloise screamed. She raised her own shotgun, but he was too close. The angle was impossible. But it was Jacob, the man who had been a ghost, a drifter, who made the final move. He did not fire a gun. He burst out the front door, a running, tackling blur of motion, and crashed into Silas Cain, just as the torch left his hand. The torch flew through the air and landed in a patch of dry grass, which immediately ignited. Jacob and Cain went down in a desperate, grunting struggle, just feet from the growing flames. They wrestled on the ground, two men locked in a final, mortal combat. Eloise ran out onto the porch. She saw the two men struggling. She saw the fire, spreading rapidly towards the house. And she saw the two remaining outlaws, taking aim at the two men on the ground. She didn't hesitate. She raised her shotgun and fired both barrels. The blast was deafening. The two outlaws were thrown backward by the force of the buckshot. Their threat ended. Now, it was just Jacob and Cain. They were silhouettes against the growing fire, two figures locked in a primal dance of death. Cain managed to pull a knife. He raised it to plunge it into Jacob's heart. At that moment, from the darkness, a single rifle shot rang out. It was not from the house. It was from the hills. A single, perfectly placed shot. Silas Cain's body went rigid, a look of utter surprise on his face. The knife fell from his hand. He collapsed on top of Jacob, dead. The battle was over. The fire was spreading, and a new, unexpected player had just entered the game. As the last echo of the final, mysterious gunshot faded, a new sound filled the valley, the thunder of approaching hoofbeats. It was not a posse of outlaws. It was a column of 24 hard-faced men, riding with a disciplined, military precision. The Pinkertons had arrived. They swarmed the valley, their efficiency a stark contrast to the chaotic violence that had just ended. Some of them immediately began to fight the fire, forming a bucket brigade from the creek. Others secured the area, their rifles at the ready. Their leader, a man with a graying mustache and the cold, tired eyes of a veteran lawman, dismounted and walked towards the porch. He looked at the bodies, at the exhausted, blood-spattered survivors, and at the dead form of Silas Cain. "Agent Harper," he asked, his gaze settling on Jacob, who was just pushing the body of his enemy off of him. "He's Thomas's brother," Eloise said, her voice a weary rasp. The agent, whose name was Fitzpatrick, nodded slowly, a deep, sorrowful understanding in his eyes. He had been Thomas's friend and commanding officer. "We got your message," he said to Eloise. "We rode as fast as we could." He looked at the carnage around them. "Looks like we were almost too late." "Almost," Jacob said, getting to his feet. He looked up at the hills, in the direction from which the final shot had come. "Who fired that last shot?" Fitzpatrick allowed himself a small, grim smile. "That would be me. A good sniper never gives away his position until the fight is over." The fire was brought under control. The bodies were taken away. A semblance of order, of the outside world's law, descended on the small, blood-soaked valley. In the days that followed, the story was pieced together. The ledger was a treasure trove of evidence, enough to keep the federal courts busy for years. The syndicate was shattered. The ghosts of the past had finally been laid to rest. Eloise and Jacob found themselves in a new and familiar world. They were heroes. The Pinkerton Agency and the territorial government owed them a debt of gratitude. The reward money for the capture and dismantling of the syndicate was substantial. They were free, they were safe, and they were wealthy. But they were also the people who had been irrevocably changed by their ordeal. A month later, after the last of the legal formalities were concluded, they stood on the porch of the rebuilt ranch house. The scars of the battle were still visible on the land, but new grass was already beginning to grow. "What now?" Eloise asked, her voice quiet. Jacob looked at her. In the past weeks, in the quiet aftermath of the storm, something had shifted between them. The ghost of his brother no longer stood as a barrier. It was a shared, loving memory. He was not a replacement for Thomas. He was his own man, a man who had, through fire and blood, found his own soul. And he had fallen in love with the incredible, resilient woman who had fought beside him. "Thomas built this place for you," he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble. "A place of peace." He took her hand. I think I'd like to help you keep it that way." Eloise looked at him, at the man who wore the face of her first love, but who had earned a place in her heart that was entirely his own. She saw not a ghost, but a future. "I'd like that, Jacob Harper," she said, and her smile was like the sun rising over the prairie. They did not forget the past. They honored it. They used a portion of their new wealth to establish a fund for the families of fallen Pinkerton agents, ensuring that Thomas's legacy of quiet heroism would live on. But they also built a future. The Harper Ranch, once a place of lonely grief, became a place of life and laughter. They married, and their children grew up with stories of bravery and justice, stories of a gentleman who was a secret hero, and of the two people who had refused to let his legacy die. The inheritance they had received was not one of wealth or land. It was an inheritance of courage, of love, and of the profound, simple truth that even in the darkest of nights, a single, defiant spark can be enough to bring the dawn.